Element of democracy in practice. We're going to pick up where we left off. We had discussed interest aggregation groups and how the presence or absence of different types of interest aggregation groups might be an interesting independent or dependent variable to help you describe why certain types of policies get passed in some countries and not others. We're going to move on now to electoral rules, and probably the most important example of electoral rules that we see in how democracies vary their practice. But electoral rules are important in a number of ways, right? There's a lot of debate right now in the United States about election rules, about voter ID laws, about how long polls should be open during elections, about how many voter booths should be available per person in different neighborhoods, these sorts of things. We saw recently that the South Dakota legislature passed a law that required that people have a street address, registered street address, in order to vote, which obviously disenfranchises homeless people. And maybe more importantly, Native American populations that live on reservations don't have American street addresses. They use post office boxes, which didn't qualify. So there's a lot of fights over how election rules are set up. Gerrymandering is another example here, right? Like how we design which voters pick which representatives matters. If we can create districts that are solidly in the favor of particular parties, we might expect that those parties will continually elect people of greater extremity in their party from that district. So each of these sorts of election rule decisions has an outcome, an effect on outcomes we might care about, like policy choices or the sorts of candidates that come out of these districts. We might also think about these things as dependent variables, right? Why are some states badly gerrymandered and other states are not? Why do some states pass permissive voter ID laws while other states crack down? Interesting questions, lots and lots of potential answers. But the election rule that we're going to focus on for this class session is the difference between a type of election style called first past the post or single member districts, in which every geographic unit, every district gets one candidate that they get to elect, and proportional representation, a system in which each geographic unit elects multiple candidates, and these candidates then represent the distribution of votes in the district. Here's a very simple way to visualize this. Say you have a situation in which the population is 75% in favor of one party and 25% in favor of another party. And let's just say that this population is evenly distributed across space. If these people get to elect single representatives from each district, represented here by the black lines, we know the result, right? What will the representatives from each district look like? Of course, we can tell already that they will all be from the red party. There will be no representation for the blue party, despite the fact that the blue party makes up a quarter of the population. Now, if instead we make this whole thing a single district and we elect the four most popular representatives, the distribution of power among our parties changes. Right now we have 3 reds and 1 blue. Given this obvious difference, it's really not hard to see why some electoral rules might affect policy output. Places that have PR systems are likely to see greater minority power and therefore more moderated policy than places that are first past the post. But we might ask ourselves the extent to which electoral rules matter for interest aggregation, right? Electoral rules and interest aggregation and separation of powers might not only affect policy outcomes, they might affect each other. So let's take a look at how we think electoral rules might change the number of parties that we see in a particular country. For this, we look to Duverger's law. Duverger's law predicts that a state will have a number of parties that is equal to the number of representatives in the lower house plus 1. At this point, I'd like you to check out the secondary link that I sent in the email for this lecture. It's a video about Duverger's law and how first-past-the-post voting encourages an equilibrium in a two-party system. So give that a look and then come back in a minute. Okay, so hopefully that provided you with a little bit of an intuitive sense of why rational voters will abandon their first choice party and migrate toward a party that is sometimes not even particularly favorable to them in order to avoid the worst outcome that's left over. If we remember that parties compete in part by aggregating the will of their supporters and promoting candidates that fit their program across the state, we also think that for a party to be competitive, they need to aggregate enough voters to be competitive in elections across the country. So Duverger argued that the application of Hotelling's principle meant that there was a severe limitation on the number of long-term stable parties. So here are some examples of Duverger's law. The U.S. elects one member to the House of Representatives per district, and so Duverger's law predicts that the United States will have two viable national parties. This doesn't mean that the United States will never have three parties. It's just that when the third party emerges, it is guaranteed through the combination of Hotelling's principle and Duverger's law to reduce back down to two over time. And because Hotelling's principle suggests that the parties should be centrist and back-to-back against one another on the beach of the spectrum of political opinion, what eventually happens is the third party that replaces the second party in a system like the United States that's fully first-past-the-post, that party will drift back towards center, and what you're essentially left with, again, is a center-left and center-right party. So when you hear, complaints about the Democrats and the Republicans being functionally identical, there's some theoretical reason to suspect that they actually are, and that they actually should be if they're rational and if voters are rational. Voters are walking to the party across the policy beach that is closest to their beliefs, and if you are a hardcore libertarian or a hardcore progressive, your walk across the beach to your centrist party is quite long, but it would be suicide for the Democrats or the Republicans to shift radically to the right or the left if Hotelling and Duverger are sort of strictly right about how rational voters are. Remember, we talked earlier in the semester about a group of Michigan school theories of voter choice that suggest, in fact, that voters are not particularly rational. And if that's the case, if there's a tribal attachment to a party, or if there are voters who are particularly passionate about individual issues, what we may see is that in some voters' choices, or all voters' choices, or all of the irrational voters' choices, this equilibrium won't hold. Another potential example of Duverger's law, the Bundestag, the lower house in Germany, elects 4 members per district, so we should predict that Germany will have 5 viable national parties. There's only one party that gets to lose. That still looks competitive according to the logic that we just saw in the King of the Jungle video. Okay, so if we wanted to test Duverger's law, it's pretty simple, right? The hypothesis that falls out of Duverger's law is pretty simple. In fact, it's right in the law. There should be one more party in a stable equilibrium than there are members of the lower house from each district, and we could probably test this with respect to Hotelling's principle too, where we see 2 or 3 parties. Those parties should be closely co-located on the partisan beach. So let's see how we do. Here's the United States. Should be no surprise that the Republicans and the Democrats are both listed here right next to one another. That's Hotelling's principle in action, and there are only 2 parties in the United States. This graph from the Strom reading shows every party that received more than a 3% vote share in 2008, or whatever year I guess it is as we go through the countries, is listed there. So the U.S. really is suffering from a brutal combination of Hotelling and Duverger. We have 2 parties that are extremely, extremely similar in terms of their policy outlooks, as rated by neutral experts, and we also only have 2 parties to choose from. The UK is pretty bad, but in 2005, we're seeing something of a switch. I shouldn't say a switch in the equilibrium, that's the wrong way to say it. What I mean is that there's a moment of disequilibrium. The Liberal Democrat Party was at this point ascendant. They had articulated a broadly neoliberal view, sort of government out of our bedroom and government into taxation and redistribution, that many Britons found to be a refreshing change from the Labour Party's more stolid labor movement style government. And so the Liberal Democrat Party poached quite a number of Labour Party voters, and actually a handful of Conservative Party voters who were most interested in the Conservative Party because they wanted smaller government. The Lib Dems were about smaller government in the main, but also about lots of social welfare. So at this point in time, the Liberal Democrat Party's more liberal leanings yanked some people away from the Labour Party and yanked the Labour Party to the left to compete with the Lib Dems for left-leaning voters, leaving the Conservative Party kind of alone over here in the conservative part of the spectrum. So this looks in this snapshot as though we've got a country that bucks the first past the post trend, and we have 3 parties. But we should note, though, that the Lib Dems got destroyed in the last election, so they're no longer a viable electoral force, and Britain is moving very quickly back towards a stable equilibrium of 2 parties. Japan has a mixed system in which some smaller parties are competitive in the lower house in major cities. It's difficult, it's tough, it's a tough row to hoe to be a member of a third party in Japan. And there's still sort of an apparent hotellings problem here in the 5 to 7 range. The DPJ and the LDP are the 2 major parties in Japan, obviously. And these left-leaning parties tend to scoop up the youth vote in some really big cities. But other than that, it's still something of Duverger's law here. Germany, as we talked about before, we predicted using Duverger's law that there should be 5 stable parties. At this point in Germany's history, in 2009, there are 6. The CSU is having a little bit of trouble these days. There's a new party coming to town that's a little bit more German nationalist, that's right-leaning, that's poached a bunch of their voters. So, one thing we might expect in systems that have lots and lots of seats in their lower house per district is that we have more moments of disequilibrium. There's almost always a party in Germany that's coming into the system new and a party that's crashing out, but typically there are only 5 parties that are getting stable returns. France has runoffs, and runoffs are interesting. So this is a type of voter setup that we haven't discussed yet. But runoffs allow you to cast your vote for your first choice, and if your first choice doesn't win, essentially you get to cast your vote for your second choice. So this pernicious problem discussed in the Law of the Jungle video goes away, right? It's possible to vote for whoever you would like to vote for, and you're not penalized. You don't have to live with the opposition stealing your vote, essentially. So what we see is that there are a handful of parties that are really, really far apart from one another in France that are popular enough to get at least 3% of the vote, and they remain viable because people vote their conscience with their first vote, and then they vote with their head in their second vote. And so what we typically saw in late noughts France is that the UMP and the Socialist Party were the 2 most important parties. Of course, these parties have almost completely disappeared in recent days. The Emmanuel Macron's movement, République en Marche, has taken over quite a bit of the sort of left-centrist sort of energy, and even stolen some people from the more conservative party. And then this Front National that you see here, the French Nationalist Party, the sort of very anti-immigrant, to some extent even anti-EU. They're interested in the French identity and managing the French economy for French people, has also experienced sort of a resurgence or a renaissance. And so the two major parties in France right now that get votes in the second runoff are the Front National and République En Marche. You should probably expect that the Socialist Party will make a comeback. I don't know what will happen to the UMP. As I hinted at in the last video lecture, we can talk a little bit about how populism and immigration seem to be changing what it means to be conservative and what it means to be liberal. But what seems to be happening is that French conservatism has very much changed, and it requires a much deeper skepticism toward immigration to be a plausible conservative in France. And because the UMP was never as immigrant skeptic as the Front National is, it's hard for me to believe that the UMP is going to come back in any major way, in the same way that the Socialist Party may reemerge to challenge Emmanuel Macron in the future. Okay, so we'll leave off with electoral rules there. So remember, we talked about a handful of electoral rules that are extremely important. Rules like gerrymandering and voter ID laws. We didn't talk about those very deeply in terms of the cause and effect. What we did talk about was how the number of legislators who are elected from each district has an effect on the number of parties and the distribution among those parties of what sorts of policies they espouse, how far apart they are from each other. And that is a result of a combination. Duverger's law predicts the number of parties, and Hotelling's principle tells you how far along the beach they should be spread. Okay, so governance, rules, and policy. Now we're talking about, from our nested rules slide from last class, we're talking about constitutional decision-making rules and institutional rules. Who gets what powers? How? Important to note that in some circumstances, like the United States, these power delineations are written down rather explicitly. The first 3 articles of the American Constitution are entirely about delineating the powers between the federal branches of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and the president. But Britain, for example, has a completely unwritten constitution. The Constitution of Britain is drawn together by Britain's judges and legislators by looking at a long history of constitutional practice and by looking at some governing documents, some of which go as far back as the Magna Carta. So there's a lot of variety in terms of where these constitutional and institutional rules come from. And it should be sort of obvious that how we divide up power among the branches of government may have an effect on the sorts of policies that the government creates. Okay, so the major distinction that we're going to cover in governance, rules, and policy is the distinction between presidential systems and parliamentary systems. So here are the basic rules of a presidential system. We have a president. Of course, we have a president. We can probably substitute the word president out for executive, and then we have comparable roles in the president and prime minister. In presidential systems, such as the one we have in the United States, our executive is elected separately from the legislature. So we have a separate election for president and the Senate and the House of Representatives. This is the same as it is in most states in Latin America and in many states in sub-Saharan Africa. Second, the president doesn't write laws. The president doesn't have the right, the power in a presidential system to write laws. Instead, the president has the power to veto. Now, notice in American politics, in a practical sense, it is often true that the presidency pressures the legislature to prioritize certain types of legislation. Barack Obama famously leaned heavily on Congress during his first term to create an omnibus health bill, which became known as Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And Obama's administration had a lot of say in terms of how that legislation was authored. But typically this is limited to big ticket items that the president really cares about. The president gets involved in a handful of legislative battles in every term, and otherwise is sort of relegated to the role of vetoing or accepting legislation. Another hallmark of presidential systems is that they have elections at regular periods. We know that every 4 years we're going to elect a new president. Every 6 years each senator is up for a term. We'll see that this is different in parliamentary systems. A fourth characteristic of presidential systems is that parties typically choose the candidates that stand for general elections and primaries. And after you have the party that will represent the candidate, or the candidate that will represent the party chosen in a primary, we then have an open vote for office. So you choose the name of the person you wish to support, and the field has typically been narrowed down to the number of parties that there are by these primaries. I should also point out that for some reason, there probably is a good reason for this, although I don't know it. It's typical that presidential systems have first past the post election rules and therefore two-party systems. And so typically you're looking at two candidates being chosen in the primaries, and then you have a head-to-head race between these two. And then the last characteristic of a presidential system, removal by impeachment. And impeachment usually requires some sort of proof of a high crime and some amount of legislative supermajority. Let me just fix this slide. Look at you guys getting to see how the sausage is made. Okay. So now that we've taken a look at the governance rules of presidential systems, we'll contrast that. Oh, no, we're not. Never mind. Got ahead of myself here. One thing that we think is true is that presidential systems are prone to coups, right? We'll talk about this when we come back in a few slides, but let's just keep this in mind. It's possible that there's an empirical relationship between having a presidential system and the likelihood that your country is overthrown by a coup. Now we can move on to parliamentary systems. Parliamentary systems are extremely common in Western Europe. Arabic-speaking countries tend to have them. South and Southeast Asian countries tend to have parliaments. Typically how this goes, frankly, is that successor countries, former colonies of the UK and France, tend to have parliaments, and countries that were declared independence in kind of the post-decolonization period or have recreated their constitutions in the post-colonial period have followed the American example and chosen to have presidencies. And when we get to those slides about presidential administrations being coup-prone, we'll see why that might be the case, why it is that people might make these choices. So again, the choice between a parliamentary and presidential system has an effect on policy outcomes in a country because the powers of a parliament and a legislature and a prime minister and a president are different from one another. But we also might care about why states choose to have one type of executive versus the other. And there may be something of an answer here when we get to talk about coups. Okay, so 5 characteristics of a parliamentary system. The first is that the executive, the prime minister, is selected by the legislature. So notice that this means that in a parliamentary system, voters don't actually get a direct choice about who the prime minister will be. Now, in stable parliamentary systems, it is very often the case that the prime minister or the leading candidate for the prime minister is known, but every person who wishes to be the prime minister needs to first be elected to the legislature in their constituency. So it's like in the United States, if you had to become a member of the House of Representatives or a senator in order to be considered to be the president, and then the Senate or the House of Representatives voted on which one of its members would become the president. That's how a parliamentary system works. So notice, like I said, this means that you vote for a candidate or a party in your district without knowing without knowing for sure who that party is going to pick for prime minister. Although typically, in places like the UK, there's a pretty clear front runner for who that's going to be. So you do have some idea who you might be choosing. A second characteristic is that the executive writes legislation. The prime minister chooses a cabinet, and the cabinet is tasked with writing legislation that falls under its scope of authority. Now it's the legislature who has to rely on the veto, right? The vote through the legislature, the up or down vote, is essentially a legislative veto. So it's very different than a presidential system. A very important one here, elections happen at a time of the government's choosing. And this has to do with the removal by no confidence. Actually, let's just cover both of those at the same time. So instead of an impeachment proceeding, which we know is sort of a very violent and rare process in presidential politics. It's rare for a president to be removed by impeachment because it requires a legislative supermajority. Usually, it requires that the opposition party has a legislative supermajority, because what legislator in their own mind would vote to remove their own executive? Well, that's exactly how it goes in parliamentary systems. Um, the the party of the prime minister votes to remove the prime minister from power through a vote of no confidence. Requires only a simple majority, and when the party is united by the idea that it needs a change of leadership, they vote to remove that candidate. Now, notice this empowers the legislator to hold the prime minister to account in some sense, in a way that's not possible in the United States. But the legislators who might remove the prime minister are taking a risk, because a removal of a prime minister through a vote of no confidence triggers a new election. We have to re-vote, we have to start over, and so the governing party needs to feel as though it's in a position to remove its own leadership and still win the next election in order to call a vote of no confidence. So that's a special case of what we're talking about here, the elections that are happening at a time of the government's choosing. There's a maximum term. In the UK, it's 5 years between elections, but the government can call what's known as a snap election at any time in between, and it's pretty common for a parliamentary government to choose to call a snap election. Typically what happens is the prime minister will win some particularly vicious battle with the opposition. They'll have some event that has them riding high in the polls, and they will choose to call a snap election then. They use that moment in polling to buy themselves another 5-year term. So they have another 5 years during which to get things right enough that they feel confident in calling a snap election. And so you either need to have a run of pretty spectacular policy failures to lose when you're the dominant party, or you have to make a decision about snap elections that was strategically unwise. Or I suppose you might really feel the need to remove your prime minister through a vote of no confidence instead of just having them step down. Okay, these are centered for some reason. Notice, though, that one of the interesting drawbacks here, maybe it's not a drawback, but an interesting effect of having a parliamentary system, is that you can't have a split government, right? In the United States and in all presidential systems, it's possible for one party, say the Democrats, to control the legislature, and another party, say the Republicans, to control the presidency. That's not possible in parliamentary systems. If no party wins a straight-out majority in the election, they have to choose between redoing the election, leaving the government in the hands of the old government for a little bit longer, whatever the statutory maximum is, probably, or forming a coalition with the parties that the members of which make up then a majority of the parliament. And then you have to wrangle over whose party gets to nominate the prime minister and which cabinet positions go to each member of the party. Okay, so one thing that we might care about, if we like democracy, is how to preserve it in the face of encroaching authoritarianism. We talked about this a little bit last week. We'll talk about it a little bit more next week when we talk about autocratic usage of democratic institutions. But we might ask ourselves, if we want democracy to survive, might the rules of governance have a role to play? Jared Cheboub argued that this might be the case, and he wrote a book about it called The Survival of Presidential Democracies, which makes the following argument. Who would be tempted to overthrow a democratically elected government, and when? Right? If we care about understanding why some democracies survive and others don't, we might start with the motivation of the actor who overthrows them. Well, one time that we might think it would make sense to overthrow a democratically elected government is if you are the executive and you have the loyalty of the army, and the legislature isn't giving you your way, and you feel like it's not giving you your way for all of the wrong reasons. So a couple of things Cheboub argues um, suggests that presidential regimes, if this is true, should therefore be more brittle. One, you are more likely in a presidential system to have a split government than you are in a parliamentary system. And as we said just a couple of slides ago, in a mainstream parliamentary system, and the main way that those are governed, that's literally impossible. So the idea that the legislature is going to give you hell if you're the prime minister, well, they're all members of your own party. So the chances that that's going to happen are relatively slim compared to a presidential system where at any time during the regular elections, a new legislative majority in the opposing party might come to power. So the temptation is going to rise more often in a presidential system. And then second, this sounds a little silly, but presidential systems require that the president is removed by impeachment, not by a vote of no confidence. If a prime minister with autocratic leanings decides to dissolve the government and take over in an auto coup, um, Parliament could meet somewhere else, secretly, I suppose, and take a vote of no confidence to trigger the next election, in which case you have a crisis of constitutional legitimacy. That's not as easy for the sitting parliament or the sitting legislature in a presidential system. Some number of people, if the president, if it's a sitting president who takes over, some number of people who share that president's party might prefer to have the single party and autocratic rule for some amount of time. And so obtaining the supermajority to impeach a president who has engaged in a coup is difficult. So this paper rule, right? This rule that's just written down. It has nothing to do with who has guns or who has money. Cheboub argues should be influential in terms of the number of coups that we see if these paper rules matter. And here we go. Indeed, existing evidence shows that parliamentary democracies tend to last longer than presidential, and the difference in survival rates is not due to wealth, so we're controlling for wealth. Remember, he's done his lit review, so we know that there might be reasons that countries collapse other than whether they are parliamentary or presidential democracies. Might be wealth, might be their economic performance, might be their institutional history, might be their military legacy or something like that. No, says Cheboub, I have controlled for all of these things. And in fact, parliamentary systems are just more stable. So here is a potential dependent variable, the survival of democracy, that may be affected by whether we have a presidential or parliamentary system. Okay, let's move on to a second type of extremely important division of power, constitutional rule type question, the issue of federalism, right? The extent to which we give minorities local control over outcomes. Okay, so in the beginning, we have a national government, which is usually given control over certain types of operational rules, in addition to its own electoral, institutional, and constitutional rules, right? So some operational rules must sit with the national authority. Typically, these include foreign policy, currency policy, and trade policy. The reason that these laws are typically, the power to make these laws is typically vested in the overarching national government is that it's hard to be a country, to consider yourself a state, a unified political entity, if every sub-state has its own ability to relate to foreigners, foreign countries, if they have the right to print their own money, if they have the right to tariff and tax their imports and exports differently. Notice that the United States actually tried this, right? The original Articles of Confederation gave us a government in which there was functionally no national state. There was no state that captured the power over these policy arenas across the 13 states. And it failed to cohere, right? This government failed to act as a cognizable country. And so the new Constitution very firmly provides these powers to the federal government. Well, okay. In addition to having these powers, we need to have powers that we delineate to more local jurisdictions. In the case of the United States, we delineate powers to states and cities and counties. Okay, so the power over other policy areas is delegated to the more local units of government, and this empowers state majorities that are minorities at the federal level to make decisions about some operational rules. And here what we typically see are welfare benefits and social policy benefits. So we think about education and healthcare, unemployment, welfare, these sorts of things are decided by the states. And the purpose for this, ostensibly, is so that all of the Norwegian and Swedish and German liberal socialists in Minnesota don't have to be told by the federal government, whether or not to fund Minnesota Public Radio at the level that they want. They all know that they'd like to live in a happy community, and they don't care what the libertarians in Alaska are doing, right? They don't want to be ruled by the libertarians in Alaska, which requires, first and foremost, that we have a division of power between the federal government and the states. So it prevents the federal government from dictating policy to the states, which makes sure that one state can't, or one locality can't, through the use of the national government, dictate what another state does. It also prevents powerful groups in any given state from dictating to each other, right? So we make sure that there's no way for the people in Massachusetts to dictate what happens in California, for example. So you might ask yourself what sorts of problems you expect federalism to solve. Why would we have federalism in the first place? Well, one thing that we might expect is that federalism, the delineation of certain types of education and welfare benefits, certain types of social policy and planning powers to more local places, is that it might prevent ethnic conflict, right? If you're giving minorities rights, they should be less likely to rebel. Well, Phil Roeder worried that this straightforward and logical theory might be wrong. Perhaps instead, he argued, if we make these local political units more about ethnicity, more about their differences rather than their similarities, then the politicians that run them will be rewarded for making everything else about ethnicity too. And so what happens is these states that have federal powers become more and more ethnically or sectarianly or religiously radicalized in this way. There's some reason for Phil to think that he might be right. 6 of the 9 ethnically divided societies failed to maintain peace and democracy despite being federal. So in order to test this theory, Phil asks whether there is an armed conflict or an ethno-nationalist crisis in places, and checks to see whether certain types of federal institutions are related to these sorts of crises. And only non-ethnic forms of federalism and power separation seemed to help. So what Phil found is that if you want to create a federalist republic, you want to manage interethnic differences in your country, what you do is not carve up states for every ethnicity, but you carve up states that include members of all of the ethnicities, and you force them to cooperate about local policy. And this allows for more flexible bargaining between all these different types of ethnicities, but it doesn't incentivize any of the leadership to create a government that is entirely about ethnicity. Okay. So then, speaking very broadly, we can put our two institutions of interest on this kind of a chart here, the extent to which we have structural separation of authority and the extent to which we have geographic distribution of authority, into a chart, right? So notice that we have some example countries here. There are places that have no federalism and are authoritarian, so they don't even have any sorts of branches of government. Everything is run through a single party or a single institution. That's sort of like Iran and China. We have places that are highly centralized geographically but have increasingly more dispersed powers within the federation. So France has a mixed parliamentary and presidential system, but they're very, very centralized. And we also see places, actually I guess we don't see any places that are confederal and authoritarian. I guess that's not super shocking. A confederal state is almost by definition not authoritarian because you have multiple leaders. But we see this wide range of geographic distribution here as well. And you'll notice that the United States is sort of paired with Brazil and Mexico and Fourth Republic, Nigeria, as a place that has a federal system. Not quite as dispersed as we could imagine. The European Union is listed up here, although the European Union, again, so decentralized, is not really even a country. And the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, really, really wanted to wish itself into being a country, but the decentralization of really important federal powers essentially prevented that. Okay, so this next section is going to make the argument that institutional and constitutional rules operate to change a different type of policy outcomes. Oh, I guess those slides disappeared. Okay, well, moving on then. Another basic difference between democratic regime types and the presidential and parliamentary system is the way that they select their cabinet. So the cabinet is the highest level of executive bureaucracy. These are the people who serve under the president, think Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. Lots and lots of policy gets made at this level. So this is a very important part of the federal government to understand the function of. So note that in two-party systems, the president is never obligated to pick minority cabinet members, right? In a two-party system, which is sort of driven by first past the post, right? We never have an election result that is a minority situation. There's never a mixed government. It's always majority, which means that the cabinet never has to include any members of the losing party. Now, typically, it's sort of been tradition that the American president chooses one or two token members of the opposing party, some centrist from the opposing party, to make a stab at being bipartisan. But for the most part, this is how cabinets in the United States operate. Because we have a two-party system, because we have first past the post voting, we have a two-party system. Because we have a two-party system, we always have a situation in which the executive is entirely controlled by one party or the other. And so as a result, we have cabinets that are never ever split. That's different where we have multi-party systems. And again, multi-party systems where the executive might have to be chosen by multiple parties. Here, it's possible to have a minority situation, in which case we have several different ways that a cabinet might be laid out. Places where there's a majority coalition cabinet, places where the minority runs a single party cabinet. And so again, you might expect that in each of these different cabinet types, we would have different types of policy. Okay. Governance rules in the legislature, things that we might care about, unicameral versus bicameral houses. The United States, of course, is bicameral. We have two houses. Usually the upper houses are chosen differently. They have different rules for how they're chosen, different thresholds for when bills can pass. Maybe they have special jurisdictions. The House of Lords in Great Britain is the upper house. It has very few powers compared to the House of Commons. In the United States, this is exactly reversed, right? If one chamber of the legislature has more power, it's probably the Senate. Unicameral legislators, we only have a single house, and bills only need one passage to become law. There is one American state that has a unicameral legislature. It is Kansas, and I would love to be able to tell you whether there is a difference between the sorts of policies that Kansas passes and other states pass. But one, I don't really know how Kansas compares to other American states in terms of their policies, other than that it's broadly more conservative. And two, there's like a crap ton of other reasons that Kansas is probably different than everywhere else, except for Oklahoma or Nebraska. Okay. Another thing that matters, the rules in committee. We talk about this in American politics pretty frequently. Do we need the committee to pass a law before it goes to the floor? Then you have a new choke point, a new veto point in the way that you're governed, and in the way that bills need to wind their way through the legislative branch, where we have the requirement of committee passage. A group of experts, at least nominal experts, have to review the bill before it's allowed to the floor. Where you have requirement of committee passage, the committees typically are made up of people who want to be on the committee, right? You hear about legislators in the United States who want to be on the Commerce Committee, who want to be on the Intelligence Committee. This is because they want to have added control over these policy areas. They find them interesting. Other systems have committee rules that focus on standing or ad hoc committees. In these cases, the committees specialize in certain topics and they see every bill that addresses them. Um, whereas ad hoc committees, you pick a new group of legislators for every single bill. So you may have someone who's really interested in intelligence and foreign policy sitting on an agriculture bill because they drew her name from a hat. So again, very different. You might imagine that standing committees, for example, attract the attention of more lobbyists. If you have a finance committee like we do in the United States or healthcare committee like we do in the United States, they're going to attract lobbying money from banks. They're going to attract lobbying money from HMOs. Where we have ad hoc committees, we shouldn't expect that because the lobbyists don't know who to court beforehand. The trade-off now, of course, you might then say, why don't we have ad hoc committees, is that members of the ad hoc committees are very rarely experts in the policy areas of the bill that they're governing, and so we might think that there's some reason to prefer people who are experts. Here's just an example of the committees that exist in some places. This is a list of the standing committees in the Japanese Diet, the Japanese legislature. And you can compare that to a list of standing committees in the United States. One last thing to talk about, the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies work for the executive typically. The president or the prime minister oversees the bureaucracy. These people usually are permanent, right? The DMV doesn't change who gets your driver's license for you every time that the governor of your state changes. Uh, Mid-level State Department employees don't change. We don't change our complete diplomatic corps every time there's a new president elected in the United States, and so we end up with this principal agent problem, right? If the bureaucrats stay, administration after administration, it's possible that they will work to enact the priorities of their own politics rather than faithfully execute the laws or the intentions of the executive. This is, sort of what Donald Trump is complaining about when he says that there is this deep state in the U.S. that is functioning against him. Right? Is the idea that there's all of these faceless bureaucrats who don't agree with what his new policies are, and they're sapping him of power because they are all either old-style Republicans or Democrats who don't want to do what Trump wants to do. Um, it's something of a curious argument because most of these bureaucrats are relatively powerless to do anything other than what the law tells them to do. But more importantly, the people who work at the DMV and the people who work as dog catchers are just kind of your neighbors. And so if absolutely none of them want to do what Trump wants to do, how did he get elected in the first place? Interesting kind of thing to note. This graph is getting a bit outdated, and so I should probably update it. But these are the positions within the U.S. Department of State that that Donald Trump had filled a year into his term. And what we see is that there was a Secretary of State, there was a Chief of Staff, and a handful of other really top-level positions. But the C-suite bureaucracy of the U.S. Department of State was mostly empty. The red were people who he held on to, or were people who he saw as Obama-era holdovers and fired them. And the blue are people who have since left, quit or retired, and have not been replaced. And so one of the reactions, one of the ways that the Trump administration has managed this perception of a massive principal agent problem, a deep state resistance against Trump's policies, is just to leave the bureaucracy empty. And that has its drawbacks too. When Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Turkish embassy by Saudi intelligence officers, we had no ambassador in Saudi Arabia to manage that problem. We had an acting ambassador who was our deputy chief of mission, but not someone who had the imprimatur of a presidential appointment. This is just a faceless bureaucrat working in the embassy. And so, if Trump's administration wanted to make sure that their will and the will of the people who elected them was carried out faithfully by the Department of State bureaucracy, Well, they didn't get it in that case, right? Because they fired who they thought was a holdover bureaucrat who faced a massive principal agent problem. But instead of appointing someone who wanted to work for President Trump and wanted to articulate the views of the administration to the Saudis, they instead left that role up to the DCM, who is even more of an entrenched bureaucrat than most ambassadors are. This is a career State Department official. Um, Okay, well, that is all that I have for the operation of democracy. I will see you all next week when we discuss autocratic operations, how autocracies operate, and why. I'll see you then.